Hello friends, now today's video is going to be one for the Amiga freaks, of which I know quite a substantial part of my audience are Amiga fans, and I know you like the Amiga videos. And today, if you haven't heard about this already, this is going to be a video to watch, as I'm finally going to give you a way to get away from the bane of every Amiga user's existence since day one. These little bastards. I'm talking about the 3.5-inch floppy disk. Now, ever since the introduction of the Amiga, this was always the de facto medium that Amiga software would come on. You got to buy a game or a serious application, it would always come on 3.5-inch floppies. In the early days of the Amiga, it wasn't so bad. I mean, you know, around the mid-80s, these actually had quite a respectable storage capacity, 880k. As we got towards the end of the Amiga's commercial life, we were getting games like Monkey Island 2, LeChuck's Revenge, or Rise of the Robots. I should spit after I say that, probably. That were coming on like 10 to 15 floppy disks, and you could actually, I think it was actually a documented syndrome, you would get disk swapper's wrist. That was actually an injury you could get from playing Amiga games. So, you look at them today, especially the format the Amiga used, double-sided, double-density disks. They're getting harder and harder to find now. Chances are, at best, you're going to get New World stock. At worst, you're going to do what I did and actually get a load of them off a friend. I got about 500 of these about 2 years ago. And probably about 250 of them had errors or just flat out didn't work anymore. They're unreliable. By today's standards, they have a pathetic amount of storage. It really is time for the 3.5-inch floppy to die a death, I think. Now, in the past, I've covered ways for Amigas that have got IDE interfaces, like the Amiga 600 and the Amiga 1200. It's really simple to add an internal compact flash card or a bigger hard disk. In my Amiga 1200, I've got a 160GB hard disk with loads of games loaded onto that and software. It's really simple on those models. It becomes a bit trickier when you've got, for example, an Amiga 500 that doesn't really have an easy way of adding a hard disk to it. I mean, you're talking about external expansions, either 25 or 30-year-old ones that were out in the Amiga's mainstream life. Then you've got to expand them because we've got really small hard disks in, or you've got to buy stuff like the ACA 500 from individual computers that cost the best part of £100. It hasn't really been that easy, and it does mean that most people I know that are using Amiga 500s are still using the dreaded floppy disk. Now, there hasn't been a solution that's been simple until now, and it's all thanks to this little baby that I'm holding in my hand here. Now, if you're not familiar with this, it's actually called a Cortex Gotek, and what it essentially is a USB floppy disk drive emulator. Now in here we've got an ARM-based device that on the back has got standard floppy disk drive, data transfer and power adapter there. And then on the front of it we have a couple of selector buttons, I'll show you in a bit more detail in a moment, and a USB port. Now until recently these were sold for use with the PC, but some enterprising Amiga fans have actually modded the firmware on these, and now you can actually use it with the Amiga's track disk device. And it means that you can essentially download pretty much every piece of Amiga software, games, demos, utilities, pop them as ADF files onto a normal USB stick, and then by putting it in the front of your Gotek and loading a bit of software, you can then trick your Amiga to basically thinking that this is a standard floppy disk drive and you're loading it off normal Amiga floppies. Very, very cool, and the good thing about these drives is they are dirt cheap. You can get these off eBay for anywhere from like 25 to 35 quid. Now I will say, as I mentioned a moment ago, these were designed for use with a standard PC, and the original company Cortex don't have any Amiga support or anything, so the modification is strictly that. It's a hack by a third party, and really, officially I suppose you should buy these and do the modification yourself. Now I've got to say a huge thank you to my friend Adam, who actually supplied this Gotek modded with the Amiga firmware already on it, and I've done a little bit of looking around today, and I will tell you that off the record you can buy loads of these off places like eBay that are already modded with the Amiga's firmware for about 20 to 40 quid. They're pretty cheap, and it saves you the hassle of doing it yourself if you want to buy a ready-made solution. If you would like to get one basically from the original seller and mod it yourself, I will leave the instruction guide in the video description. It doesn't look that complicated. It's a little bit of messing about, but really not that hard. Although I would say it's probably a simpler way to get it already done, as I did. So what I'm going to do now, I'll give you a little closer look at the Gotek, and then we'll hook up to the Amiga and I'll basically show you how it works in operation. Now, as you can see, there's not really a lot to the Gotek, and I'll show you around the various interfaces and displays and switches and ports on it, although you'll see it a bit more in operation in a moment. But this is the front of the device here. Now here is a track display that I'll explain when we're using it, but basically it shows you which disk you're currently using. Here is a standard USB port, so say you've got a USB stick here with all your Amiga ADF files on. Literally it's a case of just popping it in there. It will sit nicely in the front of it. And then we've got a couple of buttons here that are to move basically backwards and forwards through the various disks that are loaded onto your device. Now what you actually do is you load up a bit of software that lets you basically load disk images into the memory of the Gotek. So say you had a game that's got like 3 different disks, you could have position 1, 2 and 3 to be each disk of the game, and then use this selector here to go between the various disks of it. So that explanation probably sounded a little bit muddled, but I'll show you in operation. It's a lot more simple to demonstrate that to you. On the top there's not really much, or on the side either. On the back of it you've got the standard 3.5-inch floppy interface there and the power adapter, and there are a few jumpers on the top here. Now this area here is where you would attach your USB to RS232 device to reprogram the firmware on the Gotek. And I think actually this does have some flash memory inside it, because if you power it down and then load it back up, it will remember the disk images that you last loaded into it, which is pretty cool. And here you've got a device selector, so you know, if you're going to use this as an internal disk drive on the Amiga, you'll want it to be Unit 0. If it's going to be an external device, you want it to be Unit 1. So that's what that little jumper's for there. So that's basically it. There's not a lot to it really from looking at it. Most of the magic lies inside it. We'll hook it up to the Amiga 600 and we'll see what it does. So first of all, please excuse the mess that I've got around my Amiga 600 at the moment. If you watch my videos, usually you'll know that I've got my Amiga 1200 here. However, for the purposes of demonstrating the Gotek, I wanted to have a pretty much, you know, an expanded stock Amiga. My A1200's got like, you know, a massive hard disk and an 030 accelerator and all that. This Amiga 600, apart from an extra megabyte of RAM in the trapdoor, it's got a CF card inside that's unprepared at the moment, so that won't affect anything. Is essentially a stock Amiga 600. You know, if we turn it on, you'll see that we'll get the standard insert floppy disk screen there. Now I've got the Gotek here, and also I've got this cable that will allow you to connect the Gotek to the external floppy disk drive port on the back of any Amiga. Now I'll say straight away, this is not the way that most of you will want to use the Gotek. The only reason that I've got this cable here is because the system that I intend to use my Gotek with is going to be a CDTV, which doesn't have an internal floppy disk drive. Now the reason for that is most Amiga games demand to be loaded off Unit 0, which is always the internal drive on the Amiga. Now I've had a little play around with the jumper on here that I mentioned before to change it between device 0 and 1. Whichever way you do it, if you've got it connected to the port on the back of the Amiga will always see it as device 1, 2 or 3. It will never see it as 0. The internal floppy disk drive header on the Amiga is always reserved for 0. So this way, if we've got it plugged into the external drive port, it will see it as device DF1. And that will let you load, you know, system-friendly software, you know, like Workbench and, you know, stuff like paint packages, or as I've got here, a disc magazine I'm going to load up. The problem comes when you want to load games, which I know is probably going to be a big use for this. So to load games off it, you're going to have to connect this to the internal port on the Amiga. So I'll show you that in a second, but here we're loading up an issue of Grapevine magazine, which was an old disc mag from the Amiga's heyday. And as you can see, you know, it is loading through the port on the back of the Amiga fine. And you can see the little activity light in the front of the Gotek there. And I will say, this is a floppy disk drive emulator, so the loading speeds are pretty much exactly what you'd expect from a floppy. It doesn't do it at USB speed really, it does take as long as it would take from a floppy disk. So you can see it working in operation there, but really to unlock the magic of the Gotek, on the 600 and the 500 we're going to have to open up the system and put this onto the internal floppy disk header, so we'll do that now. Now, I really don't want to teach any Amiga users to suck eggs, I think the old saying is. I'm sure by now, most of you know how to open your system and everything like that. So, essentially, when you've taken all the screws out and the power is disconnected, on the Amiga 600, for example, you literally just pull out the LEDs here, and we should have access to the internals. If you've not opened your Amiga before, it might have a metal shielding covering all this, so remove that by bending the tabs off so you can access the motherboard here. We have actually got another screw that needs removing there to get the floppy drive out of the A600. And then literally it's a case of replacing the internal floppy drive with the Gotek. Now, take care to remember which way around this cable went. Some of the later Amigas had this cable keyed, so we could only go in one way, but I know some of the old A500s didn't, so remember which way around that went in. And then, literally, difficult to get out, there we go. You can see they're around the same size anyway, so it's really just a drop-in replacement. We'll get rid of the old floppy drive. Put the data cable into the Gotek. And the power in there too. Now it is actually possible to put this where the original Amiga floppy disk drive was, maybe using a bit of hot glue or even some gaffer tape or something, holding it in place and having the USB slot and the buttons showing through the old disk drive slot, which I've seen some people do. For this video, I kind of want it a bit more visible to show you how it works, so I'm not going to do that. I'll kind of rearrange this in a way that you can see everything, and we'll power it up and I'll show you how it operates. Okay, not the tidiest way of doing it. I've basically just run the cables out the back of the casing here, but as I said, I wanted to let you see what I'm pressing on the Gotek and how it's working, so you'll have to excuse the fact that it looks a bit, bit on the wonk there. So the power's put back in now, and then if I turn on the Amiga 600, well, I'll explain quickly what's on here. Now, I've loaded a bunch of ADF files, loads of games, loads of demos that you can get, from any Amiga download site, and there is a file that comes with the Gotek firmware that's called selector.adf, and I'll show you how that works. So when you've got that file on your USB stick, it will always load from track 0, and that will then let you select which are the ADF files you're going to load into the memory of the Gotek. And this is what it looks like. It says initializing DF0. If you can see the Gotek there, it says basically, there's nothing loaded in at the moment, and it will give you a directory listing of everything that you've got on your USB stick. So you can move up and down with the cursor keys on the Amiga or a joystick. And we'll try loading a game. So I'll go into games here. Now, as I mentioned, it is quite slow because you're using the Amiga's, floppy disk interface. It's best to have them all split up into letters of the alphabet, really, to make things a little bit easier. So let's just think of any game quickly. Let's try Flashback. So I've got a big list of ADF files here. There we go. So Flashback's got 4 disks. So what we'll do is we've got Flashback 1, 2, 3, and 4. So if I press Enter on the first one, and then it will give me a list of all the tracks that we can load the ADF images into. Now you can have up to 99 disks on the in the Gotek's memory at any one time. So all I do then is I go to a position that I'd like to load that ADF file into. So we'll have that as disk 1 and press return. Then I want Flashback disk 2 to be in position 2. Same with all the rest, 3 and 4 as well. Then we'll press return again. As you can see, they're all loaded into the correct positions. We'll go to the top and we'll press save and restart. It will say restarting there. And then you'll see the Gotek will move to track number 1. And the Amiga will then think that it's got this disk in its internal floppy drive. It's a cracked game, so we'll get past the cracked row. Give it a bit of time to load. As I mentioned, we're seeing basically real floppy disk speed here. But this is a really neat solution for Amiga users that can't or don't want to fit internal compact flash cards or hard disks. It's really a lot less messing about because you literally got to download the files onto it, and then as emulation goes, the Amiga thinks it's using a floppy disk, so it's virtually 100%. I do remember all of these copy protection screens that hackers had quite kindly removed for future generations. And there, as we can see, we're into Flashback now. Now we'll skip that introduction and I'll show you just how easy it is to move on to the next disc in a game. So we need to find a moment either in this game or another one where we need a second disc. So we'll try starting the game and hopefully it will ask me for floppy disk number 2. There we go, it wants flashback disk 2. Now as you remember, we put 1, 2, 3 and 4 into positions 1, 2, 3 and 4 on the Gotek. Now we have 2 buttons here, back and forward really, so we press forward, that will go to 2. Press fire, or give it a minute to realise we've swapped the disk. And the game will continue loading. And we're in the game. So that's it really, not a lot to demo. It works really simply and I can highly recommend this to all Amiga users, particularly, as I mentioned before, if you've got a system like an A500. A device like this, the really good thing about it is it will not take up any extra memory overhead. If you have a hard disk, generally you'll lose about 200K depending on the size of the hard disk. With this, the system sees it as a floppy disk drive with 1 disk in until you change it. So for a 1 megabyte Amiga 500, this thing is absolutely ideal. And there's no messing about. With WHD load, you need to get games that are all made for it and modified and everything. With this, as far as the Amiga's concerned, you're loading off standard floppy disk images. So the Gotek, highly recommended. A really simple way to do away with floppy disks and have all of your Amiga collection on a very simple device. I'll leave a bit more information on the Gotek in the video description below. Please join us on Facebook as well if you haven't already. Facebook.com/KookyTech. All of the information and the social links will be in the video description as well. Thank you for watching. I'll see you next time.